Hey guys, what's going on? It's Gatsu. So today we are talking about Frost Mage. For those of you that have been following the channel for a while, Mage was never really my go-to class. Recently, however, it has become pretty much the only class I'm playing in Mythic Plus, as 9 times out of 10, the Frost Mage just seems to do more for the group than any other class in the game. So that being said, let's take a quick look at Frost Mage and what I think you should most likely be paying attention to if you're going to plan to play one in Mythic Plus here in Battle for Azeroth. So first up here, let's take a quick peek at the talents. Now, of course, ignore the PvP talents here. They're just on there because I was doing some BGs, and I said, oh, these look neat. I've done no research on these. Do not take any of those talents on the right there in the PvP row as something you should probably do because they're probably wrong, but I'm not sure. They could be right. Who knows? But anyway, in the first row here, you have basically all 3 choices are at some point viable, depending on your situation. First, you have Bone Chilling. Whenever you attempt to chill a target, you gain Bone Chilling, increasing the spell damage you deal by 0.5% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. Of course, quick math there tells you that is a 5% damage increase, purely from doing your standard rotation. Anything that would attempt to chill the target, so that is, of course, your Frostbolt, your Flurry, your Glacial Spike will do that, your Cone of Cold, your Frozen Orb, your Blizzard, your Ebon Bolt. I think you get the idea. Pretty much everything you do will stack up bone chilling stacks for you. The only things that don't, of course, are things that are purely used to shatter, so of course your Ice Lance, and then there's a few other things you can do that obviously won't do anything because Spell Steal doesn't do that, Shimmer doesn't do that, and as far as I know, Frost Nova does not either. So, Bone Chilling is pretty much your go-to right now, as you do typically want your Water Elemental, but we'll get to that a little later. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where maybe you don't have any way to make use of your Water Elemental, you can, of course, swap in to Lonely Winter from Bone Chilling. That'll go ahead and give you a pretty sizable boost to your Frostbolt, Ice Lance, and Flurry damage to get 25% extra damage, but of course you no longer have your Water Elemental, which actually does quite a bit of damage. So if you do not have the opportunity to make use of your Water Elemental, or if he's problematic in an encounter for some reason, Lonely Winter is, of course, a very valid option. The other choice here is Ice Nova if you really need a good, strong, heavy AoE damage spell. In addition to what you already have, Ice Nova is really solid. 25-second cooldown, a bunch of AoE damage. You can also use this, of course, to make sure that your other spells will shatter, as this does freeze them. Ice Nova is huge damage. I used it while leveling quite a bit, because it was just so much fun to have that extra button. Now, the level 30 row here, we have 3 choices. There's typically only one choice that works out the best. Glacial Insulation. Ice Barrier increases your armor by 200% while active, and Ice Block applies Ice Barrier to you when it fades. This talent, for whatever reason, just seems kind of mediocre. I guess this is probably a PvP talent, but even then I think Shimmer would probably win out. Shimmer replaces your Blink, which of course is just basic mana cost, which you'll never run out of. Teleports you 20 yards forward unless something is in the way, unaffected by the global cooldown, and you can cast it while you're casting something else. This essentially allows you to basically be mid-channel of a spell. Oh no, a mechanic's going to target you on a ground effect, so you can blink away from it and quickly turn your camera and get your spell cast off anyway. Shimmer is absolutely incredible. If you are not running Shimmer, I highly recommend you give it a shot. Once you get used to utilizing it, you can do some pretty amazing things and feel like you're never actually moving when you are. Do keep in mind that 20 yards is pretty substantial. You have to get used to that range, so you don't over-blink into another mechanic, like on certain encounters and raids, and, of course, Mythic Plus. But for the most part, you're gonna love Shimmer. Now, Ice Flows, if you're going to have very predictable periods of movement, Ice Flows is great for that. It makes your next mage spell cast shorter than 10 seconds, castable while moving. This is unaffected by the global cooldown and castable while casting, maximum of 3 charges. In general, Ice Flows is typically used whenever, you know exactly when you're going to have to give a very specific phase, and blinking will not cover what you need. Ice Flows is pretty much only useful in that situation. Typically, Shimmer will beat that out. So Shimmer is mostly the only one you'll take, but occasionally Ice Flows does work as well. Now for the 45 row, right now, Mirror Image is simply not worth taking. It just does not do enough, anywhere close to enough damage. So typically you will leave Mirror Image alone. Apologies there, I got a good sneeze in there. Rune of Power is pretty useful occasionally, however this does of course suffer from the I have to move away from my Rune of Power problem. So, you know, if you have a fight where you're going to be turreting all the time and you are comfortable with Rune of Power, this is incredible, especially for very, very targeted burst damage. Most of the time, about 90% of the time, you're going to be taking Incanter's Flow. This just builds up to 20% damage increase. It's a stacking buff. You start at 1 stack, which is 4%, and it stacks up to 20 at 5 stacks. It just gives you extra damage. This is just always extra damage, as opposed to Rune of Power's very specific burst window. Getting used to Incanter's Flow and seeing when you're going to get to 5 and knowing when your cast is going to hit is a ton of min-maxing that, in all seriousness, you do not need to do. It's totally wasted effort. This is literally just a set it and forget it that'll help you do, you know, extra damage and will overall just be your best damage increase. And the level 60 row here, the only talent I have used since starting BFA is Ebon Bolt. That guaranteed brain freeze is absolutely amazing. Knowing specifically when you're going to have that and running the other talents that I am currently, Ebon Bolt is just way ahead of everything else. There is a case to be made for Frozen Touch. Sometimes this will be really solid for you. If you got a lot of haste, I believe Frozen Touch comes out a little bit ahead of Ebon Bolt. And at the moment, Chain Reaction just doesn't feel like anything I can use. I haven't really seen this used much by anyone either, so I don't think Chain Reaction is all that great at the moment. For the most part, though, Ebon Bolt is my go-to. Again, I think I've used Frozen Touch once when I had an absurd amount of haste when I started the expansion. Now, the next row here, the 75 row, is kind of personal preference to a degree. Frigid Winds has been my default. Getting a 65% snare on your Frostbolt and Blizzard is just absurd. You know, any of your chilling effects, which of course is just about everything you do, having a 65% movement speed snare that lasts, you know, a very, very long time, I believe it's actually 15 seconds, you know, is just incredible. Now, alternatively, if you do need extra roots, like on fights such as Zekvaz in Uldir, then Ice Ward is definitely a very, very solid choice. Having those extra Frost Novas can be, you know, literally life and death. So, you know, if you feel you're going to need the extra Frost Nova, definitely take Ice Ward. Otherwise, I think Frigid Winds is pretty much our default here. Ring of Frost is occasionally useful. I believe this is mostly just a PvP talent at this point. Although I have seen people use it in Mythic Plus, depending on the affixes. The level 90 row is pretty interesting. You can actually use any of these 3 talents here and get quite a bit out of them. Typically, the consensus is that Comet Storm, although it is an AoE ability, is pretty much your single target choice. It's an instant cast spell on a 30-second cooldown that does a ton. As you can see there, it's 16,520 frost damage to all enemies within 6 yards of the impact. You want to make sure the enemies are frozen with either your Water Elemental or a Frost Nova whenever you go and you cast Comet Storm, because when you do, it is all 100% guaranteed crits. Having your Comet Storm get that shatter effect is just crazy, crazy damage. There are some Mythic Pluses where we had pulled a ton of stuff and I rooted it, had my orb going, popped the root, popped Comet Storm, and just saw myself shoot up to like 80, 90k DPS for a second because it just does so much damage to all those mobs. Super, super useful in AoE situations, but also very, very powerful and is your single target choice as well. Splitting Ice, anytime you're going to have consistent cleave, Splitting Ice will basically be the only choice for you. If you're going to have 2 targets consistently, Splitting Ice is by and large the best. If you're going to have, you know, any sort of, like, you know, trash packs and that, like Mythic Plus, I basically just run Splitting Ice unless we are pulling in a way in which Comet Storm is going to be very reliably used. Tyrannical weeks I will typically use Comet Storm, however, certain instances I will of course use Splitting Ice, like Shrine of the Storm for instance, purely because of that second boss, which is horrible. But Splitting Ice just makes your Ice Lance will go ahead and it'll cleave. It'll always hit the second target nearby for 80% of the original damage, as well as your Ebon Bolt and Glacial Spike will also strike an additional target, which is really crazy because you can also get the guaranteed crit on all your targets and make Glacial Spike crit for, stupid amounts on both targets, which is pretty crazy. Freezing Rain, if you're going to have very heavy constant AoE, Freezing Rain is pretty solid. This is not typically what I go to, but Freezing Rain definitely does have applications. During Teaming Week, I was actually running Freezing Rain a little bit, and it was pretty fun, honestly. Getting the instant cast Blizzard was really nice. So level 100 row, at this point, the only choice is Glacial Spike. This just does far too much damage to not run Glacial Spike. It gives you a good, targeted, powerful burst, as well as having pretty much everything you could possibly need in a single target and an AoE, cleave setting with Splitting Ice. Thermal Void occasionally will work out well for you. Issue with Thermal Void is that, of course, you don't get the power of Glacial Spike, which is pretty much the whole reason you take it. And then, of course, you have Ray of Frost, which this is just super awkward. It is a really good spell, but in raiding, it's very difficult to run, and its damage just does not compare at all to Glacial Spike. So at this point in time, basically you just want to take Glacial Spike. It is incredibly strong. So, how do you play a Frost Mage in, basic Mythic Plus? So, it all depends on, if you're doing AoE, if you're doing single target. There's a couple of general rules to follow. I'm going to go over the basic general rules. Most important cooldown you have is Icy Veins, which I'm going to bring up the spellbook here and hover over that. There we go. Icy Veins accelerates your spellcasting for 20 seconds, granting 30% haste and preventing damage from delaying your spellcasts. Now, Icy Veins is there basically to give you a heroism, or a time warp, or, a bloodlust, whatever you call it. It gives you that buff. 30% haste for 20 seconds is crazy. Now, depending on your Azerite traits, you may also get an intellect buff if you're taking that talent. Or not talent, if you're taking that Azerite trait, rather. But this is your most important spell. This makes everything you do faster, which means you can get out more Glacial Spikes in that window. And of course, Glacial Spike is a lot of our damage. So, your top priority is Icy Veins. After that, you are looking to make sure you spend any of your flurry charges, as long as you have, fewer than, I believe it's 3 icicles, because whenever you're up at that point where you're building your icicles up, which is your mastery, between, at 4 or 5, obviously if you have a flurry, you're going to want to just cast your Frostbolt at 4, so you can get to your 5th, so you can then Glacial Spike and then utilize that proc of the instant cast flurry to make sure that your Glacial Spike crits big. But if you're under 3, if you're at 3 or under, you can go ahead and just cast the Ice Lance instead. Or sorry, the Flurry instead. After that, of course, you would have Ice Lance, but only whenever you have Fingers of Frost. Basically, the only time you Ice Lance with Glacial Spike is whenever you have a proc. Other than that, you typically do not actually cast your Ice Lance except for very specific spots, like right after a Flurry. After that, of course, you then have Ebon Bolt. If you have your 5 Icicles, you're ready to do your Glacial Spike, but you don't have a Brain Freeze proc, and you have Ebon Bolt off of cooldown, you want to make sure you go ahead, you pop Ebon Bolt, get that Flurry proc, so you can then Glacial Spike, Flurry, Ice Lance, and continue. After that, of course, Frozen Orb, and then Glacial Spike with a Brain Freeze. And then, of course, Frostbolt is your filler. Glacial Spike you pretty much only want to cast with that Brain Freeze active, or some way to guarantee it crits, i.e. a Frost Nova, or freeze from your Water Elemental. That will also cause the Shatter, which is super, super important. So let's go ahead and just get a little bit here. So in your opener here, you're going to want to go ahead and make sure you pop your Icy Vein. then you're going to cast a Frostbolt Comet Storm if you have it, then you're going to Frozen Orb. You're going to Frostbolt, pop your Flurry procs, pop your Ice Lance procs, try to fill out your Ice Lance procs there before you do your Glacial Spike Flurry combo, follow that up with an Ice Lance for a nice big crit, and then continue. From there, all you're going to do is, of course, make sure you're using your procs correctly. If you end up going over and don't, utilize that Flurry proc at 3, don't worry about it too much. At that point, it's basically just, make sure you are casting as best you can, and then there you go. Make sure you get your Glacial Spike, your Flurry, and your Ice Lance. Just get that all out there and keep her going. Frost Mage's rotation is very, very RNG dependent, and it's one of those things where, you're a little bit at mercy of RNG, but you can control it, of course, quite a bit, purely based on what you are running for talents, and, of course, obviously, when you are spending your cooldowns. Now, you see there I had that Flurry proc come up there while I was casting my my Frostbolt. So rather than cancel a cast, you just want to keep going and continue on. So that is the very, very basic Frost Mage rotation. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. As you go ahead and you play Frost Mage more and more, you'll start to see more, little nuances, those little things that make it do more damage, that, allow you to do some crazy burst on a mob or something like that. Huge Ice Lances, or, knowing that you can root something and then just chuck an Ice Lance at it because it has a frozen effect on it, that Ice Lance will crit. And whenever you're moving, if you have nothing else to do and you're talented in a Glacial Spike, if you're forced to run and you have nothing else to do, definitely toss those Ice Lances out there. They don't do much damage, but it's better to be casting something than running and doing nothing. Try to make use of every global cooldown you can. Any global cooldown that you're not doing something, you're missing out on damage. And that's definitely not something you want to do whenever you're, of course, a DPS. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, there are a few traps that you don't want to fall into. Thinking that you absolutely have to keep casting Frostbolt once you hit, your 5 icicles for your Glacial Spike. Don't worry about that. If you get to 5... and you don't have a Flurry proc, and you don't have Ebon Bolt, just cast the Glacial Spike anyway. Just keep going. Just don't stop. Occasionally it is okay to, if you really want to, you can try to fish 1 or 2 Frostbolts afterwards to try to proc yourself a Fingers of Frost proc for that Flurry, but it really isn't worth it. Overall, again, Frostbolt is your filler, and you're going to get that Flurry proc eventually. So I wouldn't even worry about it. I'd just cast the Glacial Spike and be done with it. Especially if you're cleaving, the Glacial Spike is going to do way more, way more than that Frostbolt ever would, because 1, it'll cleave, and 2, it's a huge, huge amount of damage. Now, whenever it comes to AoE, though, Frost Mage is a little different. The most important thing to do is to make sure you are utilizing your Frozen Orb, and you want to be using your Frozen Orb on cooldown for AoE, of course, and then maintaining a Blizzard with 3 or more targets. Now, if you have taken the Freezing Rain talent, you actually will want to go ahead and, as soon as you cast your Frozen Orb, you'll get that free proc for Blizzard, and you want to use it right away, obviously. But if you are, running one of the standard builds, you're just going to cast your Frozen Orb out there, drop your Blizzard, and then from there, it's just utilize these Ice Lances. Cleave around. You're going to get procs like crazy. Obviously just spamming Ice Lance isn't what you want to do, because as you can see there, whenever I cast basic Ice Lances, it's like 3k, 2k, 3k, things like that. It's really not worth it to spam that. If you have nothing else to cast, you have your Blizzard out there, you're waiting for everything to come back up, you get an Ice Lance proc, you cast it. Otherwise, you're still doing your single target rotation on whatever the priority target is. And you just continue going through your standard rotation, utilizing your Frozen Orb and your Blizzard, basically as they come off cooldown. maintaining your Blizzard on 3 or more targets will make sure that your Frozen Orb is up more often. Every time Blizzard ticks, it reduces the cooldown of Frozen Orb by 0.5 seconds. And that is, of course, anytime it deals damage. So if you have 16 mobs that you're blizzarding, you know, you're going to get 8 seconds off your cooldown every time Blizzard ticks. So it's super important to pay attention to that. Now, something else we need to talk about for sure is Azeroth traits. Azeroth traits are some of the most important things you can have as far as, you know, your damage mods and things like that. You know, trinkets, weapons, not really as important as you might think. Obviously, having the best trinkets you can get for whatever situation you're running is ideal, but your trinkets have a lot less impact than your Azeroth traits do. So for pure single target, you know, if you have access to, well, I mean, you should have access to, you know, basic mythic gear. You want Grasping Crown of the Deep, which is from the final boss in Siege of Borealis. This is Dagger in the Back, Heed My Call, and then, of course, the other traits are irrelevant. But, you know, Dagger in the Back is pretty much your best single target trait outside of Raid. Super powerful, does a lot of damage, and you want to get multiple Dagger in the Back if you have the opportunity to. It is a super useful thing indeed. Now, whenever you move into Raid, Archive of the Titans is the one you're going to want from the Raid. Unfortunately, I have Laser Matrix, or, you know, fortunately, depending on how you look at it, but Laser Matrix is really strong for AoE. It does have its dangers in Mythic Plus because it can occasionally pull things. I haven't had it break CC yet, but I get the feeling that maybe it has. I'm just not entirely sure if it's actually the culprit or if it's something else hitting a mob. You know, so do keep an eye on your Laser Matrix if you are running it, and, you know, see if it's breaking things, just so you know. And it could be potentially something you want to avoid. Now, aside from that, basically anything that you can find for AoE, Whiteout is really powerful. Ice Lance deals additional damage and reduces the cooldown of Frozen Orb by 0.5 seconds. If you have this and you're using Splitting Ice, it only reduces the cost, or the cooldown, there we go, by 0.5 seconds. It is not per Ice Lance that hits, it is per Ice Lance cast. So do keep that in mind. Now, stacking this up will increase the damage of Ice Lance, but it will not increase the amount of cooldown reduction you get by 0.5 seconds for each one of these. It is only the damage, not the cooldown reduction, so do keep that in mind. Whiteout is very powerful, however, I have been told multiple times that although this is really strong, you're typically better off taking Archive of the Titans if you have access to it from Uldir, or some of just the straight-up just stat and damage procs from basically any mythic, like standard Mythic Plus gear, things like that you can get. Azeroth gear is the hardest part of your gearing at this point, so, you know, keep in mind that basically whatever you have, you want to go ahead and get yourself either Azeroth power weights or something like that. Check out Blood Mallet, and, you know, he actually has export strings on there now, which is really awesome, and you can just pop them right into this add-on. Which, in here I have Frost Single Target and Frost AoE. So here's the Frost Single Target. These values are pulled straight from the Blood Mallet tables, and they are put right in here. As you can see, there's the various values associated with everything. This is the Single Target numbers here, which I actually haven't updated these in a few days, so I actually need to do that again. And also I'm taking something that's different here, but there's a different reason for that. But as you can see, you know, it just kind of goes through and it shows you, hey, you know, there's all these, you know, these talents here, and it has the raid and zone powers. It's a really sweet add-on. It definitely helps you figure it out and makes things a lot easier, you know, just to determine what you should be running if you have access to it. As you can see here, Dagger in the Back is a huge, huge number, so definitely keep an eye out for those. Now, as far as stats for Frost Mage, I have been gearing primarily Crit. Crit is a very, very powerful stat. I've been trying to build Crit Haste. I've got about 12, says it has 1250 Crit, about 800 Haste or so, and I got 500 Verse and like 400 Mastery. Mastery is very, very strong for AoE. Mastery in general will work out pretty well for you if you're running Mythic Plus. It increases your Frozen Orb damage, which is pretty cool. And then, of course, it increases your Icicle's damage, which I don't know if that actually buffs the damage of your Glacial Spike. I don't believe it does. But, you know, it's pretty cool stuff. For more in-depth information on how the mastery works, check out the Mage Discord or Altered Time. And there's probably a lot of information on it there. I just haven't had the time to dive too far into the mastery because I'm not too worried about it. Is there anything else I need to go over? Oh yeah, so, weapon enchant. Torrent of Elements is the only enchant you want to use as a mage, period. It gives you a 10% damage buff when it procs, which is nuts. 10% extra damage. It's also cheaper than the stat enchants because they have hotfixed that. So, super powerful, super good, and definitely incredibly useful. So, you know, definitely get Torrent of Elements. You're going to want to have 140 int gem somewhere in your gear. Somewhere it's not going to be swapped out. You know, so typically your, you know, your staff or like maybe like a bracer or something like that. It just helps out a lot to make sure you're not swapping these, because these gems aren't super expensive most places, but they are expensive enough. As far as trinkets go, Layshock's Grand Compilation is, as far as I know, the absolute best trinket that you can get at 355. It beats out most trinkets at this point, just because it does give you secondary stats. It is very, very powerful to have a bunch of extra secondaries. During combat, I sit up significantly higher than I would expect with Layshocks, and then, of course, the Reorigination Array within Uldir, which is really cool. For AoE, you're going to want to look for something like the Twitching Tentacle of Zalzix, you know, crit with an Intellect proc, or Intellect with a crit proc, in the case of, like, the Conch from Shrine of the Storm. But basically, just check out Blood Mallet again. There's trinket rankings there. And most importantly, if you're not sure, if you have trinkets that are all very, very close, you know, go and sim it. Go to raid bots, export your character data from in-game with the SimCraft add-on, copy, paste it, and just toss that right in there and get an idea of where you're sitting. There's great, great tools on there, so definitely try them out. You can't mess anything up, you can't hurt anything, you know, so just give it a shot, give it a try, and I think you'll enjoy it. But anyway, guys, that's been the basics of Frost Mage. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments there. I'll be playing Frost Mage pretty much primarily from this point forward on the channel. More on that later. There's going to be a video coming out later this week, finally. It's been a crazy couple of weeks, but I wanted to make sure that I got this out there, as this is what I'm going to be doing for quite a while, probably. So yeah, if you liked the video, be sure you liked it. If you didn't, dislike it. Leave a comment, let me know how I did. Toss me a sub if you feel the need to. Greatly appreciated, of course. Check us out on Patreon there. We're going to have some videos coming up on Patreon specifically for those people. And again, a big, big thank you to all of them. You're helping myself take care of some definitely crazy real-life shenanigans right now, which without you all would be much more complicated. So thanks again, guys, and I'll catch you next time.